We are honored that Susan asked us to introduce her today.
She has been our colleague and friend for decades. We have laughed with her and cried with her for over 20 years.
And having been under the leadership of first Jerry Wood and then Sean O'Hare, we've had a lot to laugh at and a lot to cry about.
Of course, she has been your colleague and friend as well. But we wondered, have you listened closely to Susan Odell Underwood? Have you really been paying attention?
After looking down all day, how much time can you spare to look up in the proper framework pose of praise?
Do you really know what we have in Susan Odell Underwood? We have a voice that speaks the truth of the experience of being us, a voice that asks our questions, that hollers our pain, a voice that takes the difficulties of being a human being right now in this place and speaks with the warmth of compassion.
How does she do this, you might ask? Let me quote the first line of a review of her novel, Genesis Road. Those not previously aware will notice on the first page that this is a poet writing, and be grateful. Let me say this again. This is a poet writing. Be grateful.
And we are grateful that our friend is a poet writing, a poet teaching, and a poet speaking. Her voice, strong, clear, ever questioning, ever kind, ever hopeful.
She speaks teacher, giving voice to what all we who teach have surely felt, that
we give to them our lives and strength, the domain they inherit skyward, the way we trained them to grow. These our children, though not by birth or name, who carry on our vision of a brand new terrain.
She speaks Appalachia, giving voice to this wonderful and terribly challenging place where we and our students either come from or have come to, and where we all now choose to be. And she reminds us,
it's not just here in the South, it's not just us here in the South who want to know, where are you from? Everyone everywhere means, who are you because of the place you left behind?
She speaks encouragement to countless young writers who have come through the creative writing program. Young writers who began publishing in our own journal, Ampersand, and now have their poetry in the Kenyon Review, or have novels with their names on the spines in bookstores and libraries everywhere. She has taught them that writing is not about expressing oneself, it's about expressing ourselves.
Sorry. To read Susan's poetry and prose is to recognize that one is not alone, that someone else has felt what you have felt, has lost what you have lost, has feared what you fear. So for those times when you are speechless from the pain and the loss and the fear,
listen. You can't say what you can't say. The fox, there, come down to the edge of the woods.
Our two voices under trees, the call of birds, the burr of early noon, the shadows harboring us, the secrets we needed to tell, and in the telling we'd close the distance between us. And we are grateful.
Susan Odell Underwood, would you please come up here and holler?
This is really remarkable. Wow, I just looked out at everybody. Lots of people. I joked, but it's really kind of true. I feel like I'm at my own wake. And somebody said, well, where's the booze? So anyway. Thank you to all the retired faculty here today. It's wonderful to be in your company in more ways than one. I'm only the second distinguished faculty to be honored after retiring, so I've been joking that makes me the extinguished faculty member. But I've really been overwhelmed with gratitude. Today is just really amazing. Thanks especially to retired department colleagues, Vicki Barker and Sheridan, and Ellen Millsaps and Jerry Wood for being here. Thank you to Dr. Fowler and Dr. Buckner for their support of my nomination. And I know I'm going to leave somebody out, but to Jennifer Shope, who has been so kind to me, and Julie Wright, Donnie Newman, who's just works miracles every day, Tori Knight, and my dear former student, Olivia Benjamin, who's now our fabulous administrative assistant, and others who are invisible in all of these events that we have. Thank you to Aramark cooks and servers and staff for a really great meal. Thank you to the English department and all its various incarnations through the years. When I was a student here in Dr. Millsap's Southern Women Writers class, 1981, I think, and several courses with Dr. Wood, the department looked really different than it does now, obviously. I could not have lived my work life among more brilliant, devoted, and hilarious people than with my retired colleagues and Sean, Shannon, Jennifer, Damiana, Kip, Mike, Wes, Josh, Nicole, Linda Rosser, and others through the years. The whole third floor of Henderson is busy with so many terrific humans. I'm also incredibly grateful that Carson-Newman in its various stages has supported artists. That doesn't happen at every school. It really doesn't. Let's acknowledge that how special we are. And in the art building, students have studios. My colleagues and the institution supported sabbaticals for me to write creatively. My first sabbatical, I planned to propose scholarly work, but Jerry Wood said I should just be honest about the novel I was secretly writing. I think we owe gratitude to prior and current academic provosts for that kind of leadership. Jeremy Buckner is at heart a musician. I'm grateful he's supportive of the artistic renaissance we're having on campus, thanks to folks like Noah Soltow, Heather Hartman-Folkes, and the new director of the Appalachian Cultural Center, Wes McMasters. And we should all thank Jennifer Hall for building the center in recent years to be such a welcoming hub to all kinds of artists around the region and in our community, following in the footsteps of Ernest Lee and Danny Marion. The Appalachian Cultural Center, some of you probably haven't been. It really has become this beautiful little, halcyon place in the middle of our campus. And I just want to say, nobody works longer hours for culture at CN than Kyle Berry. We just don't thank each other enough. And I have to thank my husband, Dave. He's the real distinguished faculty, the hardest working artist I ever met. After I read a poem to kick this off, I'll preach a little and then close with a poem as a sort of benediction, if you'll allow me that. I'm not sure all of you have been to a poetry reading before. Hope that's not too painful. I was told I should speak for about 45 minutes, but I'm going to try and make it shorter than that. Poiesis is a poem I'll open with. Poiesis is from the Book of Awe, which I worked on for ages, trying to find the right balance of Christian ethos and environmental imagery. The poems all have a single word title like church, faith, witness, and all the poems are written in second person, you. And the you is pretty often me preaching to myself or trying to boost myself up or give myself a lesson. But sometimes you is you, and sometimes you is all of us. There are 4 poems with titles that are Greek terms. Poiesis is a term you could read about for days. For me, it means the urge to make, that innate urge in all of us to make something, to create. And since I'm a maker whose tools are words, the subject is language. But the poem is about generically the act of making. Poiesis. In the beginning was the Word, John 1:1. In the dark, so dark it glowers, you wake. Not awake to thought, but sense, a word that shelters where the light can't reach, a magnetic possibility in ocean canyons, so far it may well swim through galaxies. It lumbers, tests its cool, safe skin, resisting other skin, to know its perfect singularity, beautifully, wonderfully monstrous, turned over and over within its power, untouched by power outside itself. Only the word, coming to know its purity, heaving up under the sweaty blankets to touch mute distance closing fast between the mind and the light, seeking again the kin between what is made and unmade, made and unmade, diving and surfacing back to the hapless repeated making and unmaking, back to the strange eclipse in which you notice you are the field and also the page, made so by the love which makes you, which made you, turning on the axis of that breath which breathes the very dust alive with naming. Now I'll really start. If I had a thesis statement, the kind English professors harass our students about, it would be that the arts are not a luxury. The creative and imaginative arts are not a luxury. Music, painting, poetry, film, these are not luxuries. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir, to a lot of you, but I'm going to use my platform to evangelize the arts. I believe we're at a real boiling point in our society, partly because we don't foster or fund or spend enough time with fiction and poetry and history and the finest examples of human thought. We don't spend enough time truly listening to music and performing music or going to art museums and attending plays. Art makes us nicer. It's not a chicken and egg debate. Kind people are not drawn to the arts. The art we experience teaches us empathy and emotional intelligence. Just imagine a world with no Mozart or Beyonce, no Gregorian chants, no hymns, no pop country or Led Zeppelin or Joni Mitchell, not even the theme to Green Acres that earworms its way into your nightmares. During the pandemic, we all discovered how much we depend on books and streaming services and music to get us through solitude and difficult times. Yet I'm not sure we're translating that recent discovery into more courses in the arts and humanities or more respect for artists. At every level of education, it seems as if courses in creative writing and visual and language arts are on the chopping block. We sort of assume all the Taylor Swifts will rise up and find their own way. But even for the most talented writers, poets, playwrights, musicians, photographers, these disciplines require years of practical training as well as education in the history of the art forms. And at upper levels, those of us in the creative arts study and teach theoretical foundations. The arts require not only the devotion to craft and tenacity, but emotional training and intellectual rigor. The arts don't appear out of thin air like we'd like to believe. Imagine no artists throughout history because no patrons funded them, no benefactor set up studios for apprentices. We'd have no Rembrandt, no Picasso, no Mary Cassatt, no Jacob Lawrence. Without arts in schools, we'd have no Kehinde Wiley, no Jenny Holzer, no Barbara Kruger, no Deanne Arbus. I'm playing with you. I realize only a few of you know who those latter artists are. And I'm sure I cannot name the premier figures in your fields. But we all know the famous rich guys in our society and politicians and sports figures and moguls. So it's obvious we have the aptitude to know major makers. We sure know Mr. Wonderful. We know the name Kardashian. This is because we give way too much credence to the vetting money does in our society. We don't usually know artists until they're rich and famous, or better yet, long dead. But every famous, rich, dead artist used to be somebody's child, student, neighbor. Imagine no Walt Whitman, no Emily Dickinson. Imagine no Robert Frost. You know those three. Our students do not. Typically, I find even our creative writing majors have never heard of Frost or Dickinson or Whitman until they come to Carson-Newman. But how much longer will we teach the work of these musicians and artists and poets, even in the privileged corners of colleges? How much longer will any of the arts and humanities be deemed necessary by somebody with purse strings? I'm an incredibly pragmatic person, so poetry often feels anathema to my nature. Poetry is not a practical field for a girl to be in. And I'm pressured by the busy world, the moneyed world, to feel that poetry is extraneous. I worry about my students who are drawn to poetry. I think I remember apologizing to Olivia, like, I'm sorry I made you love poetry. Are we frivolous? I mean, I really ask myself that question. Are we dreaming against all odds? I often tell beginning poetry students they must be the toughest of the tough because our society has been conned into thinking it does not need poems, but it does. Imagine no Wordsworth, no Keats, no Elizabeth Bishop or Muriel Rukeyser or Anne Sexton in the first poetry course I took with Danny Marion. No John Berryman, no Frank O'Hara, no Diane Seuss. Diane Seuss won the Pulitzer Prize in Poetry this year, and she's a Facebook friend of mine. That's a bit of tedious evidence right there. Even the most famous American poets are so overlooked by our society they haven't reached the 5,000 friend limit. I get it, times change, educational trends change, but who is driving those educational trends? Probably not educators, definitely not students who want to be creative. Maybe cultural evolution makes us view the arts and humanities like dinosaurs. We think that time should have frozen like butterflies in amber, the ancient beauties like painting and opera and poetry, ancient artifacts. And maybe these disciplines, especially poetry, are maligned because they've been stereotyped as difficult and elite. But the arts are not elite, or they don't have to be. My friend Dawn Kopic, whose dad taught here, says nothing changes if you don't fill out the comment card. When we buy books or attend poetry readings and plays or concerts, we are filling out the cultural comment card. For the creative and imaginative work of citizens to be more democratic, more of us simply have to show up. If we do view the arts as elite, a luxury, we have to ask, well, who tells us they're a luxury? Do we really want to hand over the expression of our culture to elitism, to only those who can afford big art experiences? But even for wealthy people we think are earning big bucks just so they can afford opera tickets and paintings and poetry books, the arts sometimes hold a certain place of loathing. Doctors always moan when I say I teach English. This past winter, during that chit-chat before an awful dental procedure, the clinician asked what my afternoon class would be doing. I said we'd be reading modern poetry. You'd have thought we were going to learn how to club baby seals. She really stepped back and said she sure wouldn't want to be my student. I lay there giggling apologetically, looking at all those sharp, shiny instruments, wishing I'd said we were going to be learning how to make scratch biscuits. But you know, I can write a poem and I make a mean biscuit. Dialectics, people, just ask Brian Austin and John McClellan. You can hold two seemingly disparate things at the same time. I can be a hillbilly and know my way around a sonnet. The good news is so can you. Biscuits are not a luxury. The arts are also not a luxury. They are all around us. They shape us. The arts are what little kids naturally ask to do when it's storming and they can't go to the pool. The arts are reading your grandkids Where the Wild Things Are and Go Dog Go. The arts are what we indulge in as we fall asleep with that novel in our hands. The arts are the quilt we sleep under, the stained glass in our churches, the thriller we listen to on audiobooks. The arts are as simple as streaming Netflix and looking at a friend's nature photographs on Facebook. They are also as complex and expensive as we allow ourselves, flying to New York to go to the MoMA or the Met or to a Broadway play. But the arts are also as close as Gentry Auditorium and the Barter Theater in Abingdon. And so many of the arts we often overlook are free, like the Knoxville Museum of Art, the Emporium, our student galleries here, our library. Libraries, one of the greatest human inventions ever, free. But we shouldn't expect art always to be free. We should pony up sometimes. We should buy that ceramic mug in the Glades or that hand-loomed table runner in Berea. How do all those artists have the time and money and energy to learn their crafts and create? Who fosters these talents? Who were the teachers of the artists and musicians and writers you admire? And riddle me this, Batman. Why do we encourage our children to take piano lessons and get out their crayons and go to the art museum with class and attend their first play on a field trip when we do not encourage adults to do the same activities or allow ourselves to experience art? Why do we value what we value? Why do we dismiss what we dismiss? Who will speak for our culture in our time? And what culture will we leave behind which will speak for us hundreds of years from now? And we have to wonder, what's in this creative life for the artist, the writer, the poet? Benedict said, laborare est orare. To work is to pray. My vocation beyond teaching is writing. When I write, when I'm really cooking with gas, that's my closest kindred expression to God. I am standing on my emotional, intellectual, spiritual tiptoes to put sentences and groups of words together which have never, ever been put in that combination before. There is a spark, creation, epiphany, revelation. I used to feel when I practiced Chopin or Beethoven when I was a kid that those composers' spirits, their best selves, were in the room with me, that I was speaking for them in my generation. I felt I was part of a musical legacy. But I found language came more naturally to music than music. Now, whether I publish or not, in the act of writing, I'm part of a continuum which includes Virginia Woolf and Alice Munro and Louisa May Alcott. I touch history and the future. I am struggling with a task that speaks my humanness, my imperfect, perfect humanness, as God intended, however limited it may be. The act of writing speaks myself, which is made in God's image. I am praying, laborare est orare, when I am doing this work of wrestling with the human invention of language, wringing the most potential out of the talents I've somehow been mystically, and I believe divinely, granted. I also understand that phrase, laborare est orare, when I'm in the classroom. I'm sending up a huge prayer, especially when I teach the creative kids. I have to believe in the dignity and agency of every student in our care if I'm going to help them find their own spark in the darkness. I saw too many young women of my generation have their career plans decided by their parents. They were not allowed to major in art or English or music. And so I'm convicted to help students in my care achieve success in writing if they believe they want to write. It's my obligation, my job description, to help them reach their unique God-given potential, using the talents of the Spirit they carry around. Sometimes those are not the kids with the most obvious promise or the clearest life dreams or goals that will easily translate into a paycheck. We perhaps don't always consider the students who aren't ever going to be productive in the way capitalism desires people to be. And yet those kids who are the creative types are also in our care on this campus. The very shyest and most likely to be closeted poets, the theater kids, the kids who are late to class because they've been up writing fan fiction until 3 a.m, they are our offspring too. We're responsible for the kid who has a hard time speaking and making eye contact and sits at the back of class. But later, at graduation, we find out the stage is their comfort zone and they majored in voice. These are the children of parents who have great hopes that their kid won't go into poetry or graphic design or violin. But they're gonna, even though society by and large doesn't value these disciplines with a good salary. Many of our students who are in theater, creative writing, the visual arts will have to earn a paycheck some other way, which I find heartbreaking and maddening. There is honor in these creative vocations. These students still have a right to expect a terrific education in their most beloved, divinely inspired talent. Those kids who are not leaders, who are not interested in disciplines which are popular or lucrative, we also have to teach those kids and keep teaching those kids because they will keep coming to us. We have to find a way to guide every student in our care to their best life. Those of us who teach LA 101 and what I still call freshman composition know the jumble and mangle of a general education class, and somehow it seems the unique kids often end up in smaller classes with me. They might be able to hide if they were in larger classes. Dr. Hall will attest. She was shaking her head coming down the hall last year when she'd looked in on one of my classes. I often teach really eccentric small groups of students. All of you who teach know that every single class you've ever stood in front of has its own personality, sometimes from the minute the first class starts. A few times I've said outright to classes that together we are an island of misfit toys. You may remember the animated Rudolph special at Christmas. The Misfit Toys, it's really a great story. It's a great ending. In fact, Ondus Webster's wife, Jennifer, was in a freshman writing class, which actually seemed to adore that nickname. And I'm not being snarky. I've been on the island of misfit toys my entire life. As a student here at Carson-Newman, I found my own tribe. One of the greatest boons for the Carson-Newman student is that historically, even the oddest bird finds a loving group here. What we don't talk about is that these students don't just randomly find their way to acceptance and fulfillment in their own special gifts. They don't just haphazardly find a way to reach their full potential. We, their professors, who are typically odd ourselves, but have found our people, must honor each student where they are. And we have to foster a climate in our classrooms in which each student is honored and heard and seen. It's a nearly impossible task because we want them to have money to buy orthodonture for their kids someday, and nice houses, and eventually have retirement accounts. But first we must help them have faith in their creative gifts. We have to express somehow that God has sent each student to us to be loved, not just accepted or affirmed, but loved. And that's really, really the hard work that we do. But it's our calling above all else. And part of that love involves offering a place in our curriculum and classes and discussion and lives for the arts. In that class I mentioned, I want to give an example. There was a young woman in the front row who crocheted and knitted unless we were actively writing, and I let her. She was an art major and a math major. Mr. Houston in the art department asked her why she didn't knit or crochet for art, and she basically said her dad wouldn't like that. She herself didn't take seriously the talent that she had, what she spent hours on every day. I was in a similar situation in college. Poetry was my secret hobby, something I hid in a notebook under my bed. Music was my initial major, big and public and lucrative enough, I thought. Poetry was a side gig, just like the students knitting and crocheting. But I signed up for Danny Marion's creative writing poetry course, and here was an adult who saw value, a spiritual gravitas in my writing. His respect for poetry, for my poetry, changed my life. He took me seriously in ways I had not. The student in Mr. Houston's class started knitting and crocheting little sculptures. Right off the bat, she crocheted a hamburger. Lettuce, tomato, the little sesame seeds on the bun. It is spectacular. She later combined her skills in math and textile art and now makes money selling patterns to make this food art. She calls it yarn cuisine. So you should look up her shop. It's really great. I bought a piece of crocheted blueberry pie from her. That artwork brings me so much joy. It's just funny and frivolous. I talked to her last homecoming, and I think often of the unlikely path she's taken and how her knitting in class drove me a little crazy. My mother asked when I was 48 years old about a particular poem of mine she liked. How long did it take you to write that? I was not being smart alecky. In fact, my answer surprised even me. I said, 48 years. If artists and writers were good capitalists, we would be clearer that the work we do is priceless. It's not measurable, the hours and the years that we've put into learning what we learn. Yet, the arts are not a luxury. That's the paradox. I paid $100 for that crocheted slice of blueberry pie. But whenever I buy art, I know I'm not just paying for an object. I'm paying for all the years the artist spent learning their craft and developing their imagination. What I pay is pennies on the hours of a life well spent. I have found, though, this is the hard part, but believe me, anyway, I'll just read it. I'm not going to go off script. I have found that sort of patronage of the arts, it kind of scandalizes some people, actually. My husband Dave and I and many other oldsters at CN have been here and stayed here through really lovely times, through stressful times in our departments, and through grief when we've lost a colleague. and through really devastating times for the whole campus. After we had our biggest crisis, there was a lot of healing to be done afterward. The faculty had been told not to speak directly to any members of the Board of Trustees for quite a while, and that created a toxic atmosphere. After the crisis, somebody very wise decided to hold a reception for the faculty and the Board of Trustees together, and I still think this was a brilliant moment, an opportunity for some really positive momentum forward. I'm nervous around people who are wealthy and powerful, but I tried to put myself out there. I can't recall the names of the folks I passed pleasantries with that afternoon, or the name of the board member's wife who sort of buffaloed me. I was standing with some members of my husband's department, and I'm always so proud of him. As the director of the 2 art galleries on campus, he has curated more than 350 exhibits of visiting artists, faculty shows, and all the student shows. And they're always trying to slip in something controversial, so he's done a pretty good job with that. There have been lots of exhibits by former art and photo majors. So I was explaining to this lovely wife of the trustee that the current show was an alumni exhibit. I said I hoped she'd stop by the Warren Building and see the paintings, all based on biblical figures. It would be a moving experience. I told her I try to support student artists and visiting artists when I can by buying a work every year, and that I was so thrilled with the piece I had just bought from this alum. Jennifer Hall also has one of this artist's pieces in her office. The board member's wife looked at me a little oddly, and I could tell she was displeased with me. She said, "If you can afford to buy art, we're obviously paying you too much." Of course, I'm a hillbilly. So I felt instantly shamed by a person of wealth and imposing status, and I stuttered backwards that the price, it really wasn't that much. It was less than a couple $100, just assuring her like I'd assure my mom. But of course, also because I'm a hillbilly, when I got home, I was seething, and I was angrier with myself than anything else because I missed a teachable moment. The wound she struck had nothing to do really with the salary that I make or that we're paid. I was struck by the fact this woman surely had no art in her house, in her life. She would not allow herself to spend money on what she saw as frivolous. Of course, none of us do. She had been hoodwinked into believing art is a luxury. And sure, the more tremendous wound, and very common, is that often people in power above those of us who are teachers, artists, poets, librarians, professors, have no idea what we really do for a living. I would tell her now, $200 is nothing compared to the more financially lucrative life I gave up willingly to devote my whole life to the arts. How many tens of thousands of dollars of earning power do teachers have above what we're actually paid in a lifetime? Obviously, my earning potential has meant less to me than my intellectual and emotional life. And I have spent so much money and so many days of my life going to museums, riding thousands of interstate miles in some jolt wagon rental vans with Dave to his exhibits. And don't forget the art supplies. We've spent money on gas and hotels to show up at bookstores and libraries and conferences to me to read poetry to 12 people sometimes. Why have I lived my life this way? Why have I always understood that the arts are not a luxury? Why has it been obvious to me that the arts are a sort of salvation? They are a healing balm. They are the connective tissue in any community and society. The arts and humanities, all the creative acts, are given to us as a sacred trust, the expression of the cosmos distilled through our human bodies, minds, ears, hands, hearts, spirits. The arts are the divine gift of human expression. In the summer of 2013, Dave's youngest brother, Greg, was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. Get your screening starting at age 45 now. Don't let Greg's death be in vain. He was among the statistics that made doctors and insurance companies change the protocols for screening. He lived miraculously for 4.5 years, dying in late 2017 after a final Christmas with his whole family. This to the brain left Greg nearly paralyzed on one side. But those early days were just a race to find the right treatment and keep him alive as long as possible. Since Greg was single and lived in Charlotte, North Carolina, and Dave and I were nearest geographically, and since we have summers and Christmases off, it seemed obvious to the rest of Dave's big family that we would care for Greg by default, and it was an honor to be with him in his illness. But one reason I'm retiring a little bit early is that the wind never came back in my sails after that struggle, and the struggle with my mom's dementia that ratcheted up just after Greg passed away. It's been a decade of a lot of caregiving in our family. Anyway, the first surgery and start of chemo for Greg were challenging. Lots of trips from Jeff City to Charlotte. After his initial intestinal surgery, the bigger, scarier surgery was set for that Christmas when we would all be off. He was on an academic schedule too. When doctors at Duke would take nearly 2/3 of his liver to get rid of metastasis there. Did y'all know your liver grows back like a starfish, a sea star? That was the hope, that Greg's liver would regenerate and stay healthy. Christmas season during a time of illness is sad. It's just sad. But on top of that lost aloneness, it was scary. We were aware the surgery could be fatal. But even with the fairly immediate success, we knew Greg had a long recovery ahead. And then what? More chemo, probably more surgeries, more Herculean efforts to save his life. So that time before Christmas, we put on our best Oscar-winning performances of joy and goodwill. We did everything we could to make Greg feel hopeful and loved in the hospital. Baskets of goodies, he loved little puzzles, books of crosswords. Greg actually designed and published crossword puzzles and got paid for getting those published. He won national awards for his handbell compositions. He was really a true genius. Dave's mother will tell you still, he was my favorite. She doesn't care who hears it, you know. He was as brilliant in much more lucrative disciplines as he was at the arts. But even though he majored in economics at Duke, he performed junior and senior recitals in piano, equaling or eclipsing the abilities of music majors there at Duke. He was the first full-time piano accompanist at UNC Charlotte, and he was, we found out after his death, way more famous than we knew in Charlotte from his many performances with the symphony. In other words, for all his brainiac ways, he chose to live the life of an artist, playing piano and organ in church, directing handbell choir, teaching piano lessons, playing music for hours and hours every day, learning these pieces for the vocalists and the symphony to play with them. He could have earned a bajillion bucks doing economics, I'm sure. He was hilarious, though quiet and quirky. He was also determined to live as long as possible, as well as possible. After the later brain surgery that paralyzed one arm and one side of his body, he played piano with one hand. And he told us, even if he could never play again, he could write compositions. We found several beautiful compositions for piano and handbell on his computer after he died. A handbell group in Charlotte performed one posthumously. But Greg was, above all, a perpetual boy, the youngest brother, the baby of 6 kids. So to lighten that dire feeling, that liver surgery Christmas, we bought silly reindeer antlers, the kind that light up. We'd get in the elevator at Duke Hospital in those days, that Christmas, to ride up to his tiny hospital room and rearrange our faces into smiles. We didn't meet the surgeon until the day after Greg's surgery, when Greg pointed him out at the end of the hall where he had been already up and trying to start walking again. We loped along wearing our antlers, tugging Greg's IV stand one painful step at a time. The surgeon turned when we reached him, interrupted his talk with colleagues and nurses. He took one look at the sparkly felt antlers on Greg's head and with kind of a dour look of disapproval said, "Nice hat." I couldn't speak. We must have broken some kind of sovereign rule. I felt censured. We listened to a blunt mini lecture about Greg's recovery potential and took up as little of the surgeon's time as possible. As we walked away, I heard a voice in my head, an actual voice, like some of us do when we have imposter syndrome or a sense of our insufficiency. That voice said, "I'm a worm." I was struck again with the thought I could have made more of my life. By society's standards, by the yawning cavern in my bank account, I was a worm. When people ask me what I do for a living, and this is not true, I really love my profession, sometimes I joke, I correct errors the size of fleas, because a 12-point comma is pretty much the size of a flea. I could have been a doctor or a nurse. I could have helped people who were in really dire situations. Instead, I grade essays and write poems and make up characters in my head. That Christmas, I lost sight of the worth of my talents. We spent the rest of the day in Greg's tiny hospital room, and then day after day, hiding our sad sack weariness, going back to our hotel at night, missing all the faraway celebrations with my family in the Underwoods. The good news came, though, that we got to take Greg home a few days early. Christmas Eve before lunch, we sprang him from the prison, 10 days after his surgery. We felt his sense of relief and release out in the cold air, free and past that danger. We had met him in Durham for the surgery, so Dave drove Greg in his car, and I drove ahead in our car back to his condo in Charlotte. I got there a little bit before then because Dave had been warned to drive really carefully with Greg. I was already settled into fixing the dinner I had planned for Christmas Eve. I was making Greg's favorites, the basics, the good stuff. He hadn't had really good food for quite a while, and Greg loved to eat. When Dave helped him through the door, I had the kitchen smelling pretty good, but Greg didn't even get a glass of water. He didn't look at his stack of mail. He didn't sit down at the dining table, but made his way to his piano, which divided his eating space from the living room. He started immediately banging away at Christmas carols and the classical pieces he had learned to accompany students at the end of his semester at UNC Charlotte. So many epiphanies ran through me as he played. First, I realized more than he had missed family or freedom or fresh air or good eating, he missed his piano. I wish I had a recording of him playing, and he played loudly, muscularly, always. It had to be tough on his surgical site for him to play like that for at least a half hour, maybe more. And I was redeemed by his artistry, no longer a worm. His music transformed me and taught me. I was thrilled again to be humble and happy with my own skill set, to help others be silly with silly hats, to be able to make a feast in a tiny, cramped condo kitchen with a bachelor's terrible pots and pans. My epiphany will never leave me, that not all of us, not very many of us at all actually, will need 2/3 of our liver removed. But every day, every single day, we need pianos and music and musicians. We need paintings and photographs on our walls like Greg had all over his house. We need novels and poetry and symphony orchestras and handbell ensembles. We need the arts. We need artists. We are not a luxury. Now I want to read just a last poem for you guys. And some of you will think this is kind of dark, probably, but I mean for it to be, I was glad Jennifer called me hopeful. I don't always feel hopeful. This is from my newest book, Splinter. The poem is called Commencement. I think we're all in the job of commencement here, and I'm about to have the hugest commencement of all, retiring. I've always loved that Appalachians, what we say is, I'm fixin' to, and that's what commencement feels like to me. I'm fixin' to. This poem is a sort of prayer, really, a benediction. If you'll allow me that latitude. It came to me at graduation in the gym. I was thinking about school shooters and bombs. One thing about having a good imagination is that it doesn't always tend toward buttercups and unicorns. There's a lot of dark stuff in there too. People with vivid imaginations can think up some pretty horrific stuff. But this poem doesn't mean to reside in the dark. It's a momentary supplication for a safe and simple life. There is a reference to Psalm 103, which is a psalm attributed to David, in which he praises God for forgiveness, redemption, tender mercies. No Jerry will like that. And a sense of well-being. The end of my poem is probably ambiguous. It contains a spectrum of possibilities depending on the reader. I experienced the ending, like I said, as earnest, with a feeling that goodness is always possible when we commence. But if you hear the end darkly, you should go away and study on the why of that and come talk to me maybe. This poem, Commencement, is in this collection Splinter, like I said, which is about the Appalachian diaspora. In my generation, The Brain Trust skedaddled out of eastern Kentucky and southwest Virginia and East Tennessee as soon as we could. We lost a lot of, all my cousins live somewhere else. The poems are also about those of us who stayed here because we felt we're just lucky to be able to be here, or we felt led or called, and how bereft we are when most of those people we loved left the region for better opportunities or the freedom to be themselves. I'm hopeful that our students no longer need to exile themselves from Appalachia in order to be free and fulfilled, and especially not to be fulfilled as artists. We need them. Commencement. Help us not to consider our enemies flourishing like the flowers of the field, as many as the grasses. Help us not to imagine terror right here as the speaker's honeyed voice lifts during the middle of Psalm 103. As he prays, please keep us from the distraction of the ugly inkling that we might be deafened in the second millisecond of the fiery blast that could shatter this gymnasium, mangle its rage through all the bodies gathered here in the name of our children. Lord, help us to worship not you, but this moment and the one before, this moment and the one after. Fill us with gratitude everlasting for the silent peace around each word, for the breaths we take together in congregation. Help us take for granted the irritation of crying babies and rude coughing and flash photography. Fill us up with nothing but the earthy scent of our sweat, rising up clean under graduation robes and Sunday dresses, the suit coats of fathers and uncles and grandfathers. Pour across us the sour smell of 1,000 skidding sneakers and the sweet odor of floor wax. Protect us in our boredom as each name is called, our mild applause and congratulations. For truly this is a hollow place, a house meant for shouting hoots and referee whistles, where worship can hardly take hold. Lord, we are a little people, easily overlooked. Please help others to overlook us. Keep us safe from the monstrous in the middle of America. Far from money and skyscrapers, please sanctify our mediocrity, our foolish faith that no one has any reason to harm us. We bow our heads for the benediction, but can hardly close our eyes against the beautiful flesh of the maple floor, emblazoned with our home team insignia, our colors. Above us, the scoreboard says nothing. Its clock set at 0 hour, and the basketball nets hang empty, signs as hopeful as any you have ever given.